Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Richard Evans. I'm Rees Professor of History and President of Wolfson College, and also was many years ago a graduate student at St Antony's College, Oxford, at the same time as Margaret. So it's a particular pleasure to welcome you all and to this second in this series of lectures. Now, as you probably know, the Humanitas Professorships were created by the vision and the imagination of Lord Weidenfeld, George Weidenfeld, one of the 20th century's and 21st century's great publishers, and it's wonderful to see him here tonight sitting in the second row. So I think we should just applaud George. And of course there are a large number of these Humanitas Professorships now here in Cambridge and at the other place, and they've been very successful, and particularly I think this series already, from what I've heard about last night. Unfortunately I couldn't be here, I was in Munich giving a lecture myself, but I'm looking forward very much to tonight's lecture. This particular professorship in war studies has been made possible by the support of Sir Ronald Grierson, and it's also a great pleasure to see him here tonight. So I think we should give him a first. I'm not going to spend many words introducing Margaret MacMillan. I'm assuming that all or nearly all of you were here last night, but she has scored a great success with her book, her recent book on the origins of the First World War, and of course what she's talking about tonight, thinking about war before 1914, relates very closely to that. So I'll leave the rest to Margaret.
Well, thank you very much, and it is a great pleasure to be here and to be introduced by Richard, and also a great pleasure to have here Lord Weidenfeld and Sir Ronald Grierson, who've done so much for this series. Thank you both very much indeed, and thank you to people in Cambridge for coming patiently to listen to me yet again. Last night I was talking about the ways in which war and the relationship between war and society was changing in the 19th century. War was becoming something which involved far more people, the shift in thinking which was spurred by the French Revolution, among other things, from people seeing themselves as subjects to seeing themselves as citizens, helped to bring about a new relationship between the state and the individual. People were no longer seen or no longer saw themselves as subjects, but increasingly saw themselves as sharing in the polity, sharing in the government of the state, and therefore having a corresponding obligation to the polity, to the state, to defend it if needed. That was one of the important changes in the 19th century, but of course there were others. War was getting larger in scale and in duration thanks to the Industrial Revolution, which made it possible to summon up much bigger armies, to move much bigger armies, and to keep them in the field for much longer, and to continue to equip them as they were in the field. War was also becoming, thanks to the various successes of European industry and science and technology, a lot more deadly. The Europeans were getting better at producing armies and navies. They were also getting better at killing each other. There was also, as the century went on, a move towards total war, a move towards seeing not just the enemy soldiers as those who had to be fought, but seeing the whole society which had produced them and sustained them as part of the enemy. And so the old barriers, which were always in danger of being breached, but the old barriers between the military, the combatants, and the civilians now began to be blurred increasingly. And by the time you got to the First World War, you were going to see the British talking about the German race or the German nation as an enemy, and you were going to see the Germans talking in the same ways about their enemies, and you were going to see civilians increasingly in various ways getting caught up in war, either being forced to do labor as objects of war, or in the case of German civilians being blockaded by the British Navy and suffering at least a share of the deprivations that followed that. What was also happening to war in the 19th century, and that's particularly what I'd like to talk about tonight, was that war was becoming increasingly powerful on the defensive side of combat. In other words, the ways of defending were now becoming stronger, and the ways of attacking were having real problems in dealing with that. It was becoming increasingly costly to attack a very well-defended position. Weapons were firing faster, further, and were more accurate, whether they were the standard infantry weapons or the field or larger artillery that was brought in. And increasingly, armies were resorting to entrenchments. The shovel became a very important part of a soldier's equipment, and soldiers became increasingly adept at building entrenchments from whatever material was to hand, whether it was sand, mud, or logs. It is interesting, I think, that when Sherman's troops went on their famous march to the sea, which I mentioned last night, which was done very much as a way of punishing the civilians in the South, when Sherman's troops went on their famous march to the sea, they threw away their bayonets but not their shovels. They recognized what was the important thing, what the important piece of equipment, and even things such as barbed wire, which was originally devised to keep cattle from straying on the prairies, was thrown into the mix. And so barbed wire strung in front of well-defended entrenchments added to the difficulty that came in attacking. Now, people were aware of these changes. It wasn't that they were blind to them, and you saw in speculative fiction, for example, talk about the ways in which war was changing, what the future of war would look like. H.G. Wells, always in many ways ahead of most other people, even talked about tanks as a possible way of trying to deal with the power of the defense. And the military themselves spent a great deal of time talking about what the new power to the defense meant. They've often been portrayed, and I think I mentioned this last night, as being very hidebound, of being stuck in the old ways and not being prepared to consider that war was changing. I think this is unfair. The military were aware that war was changing, but they didn't always much like it. And I think that reflects in part a natural resistance to change. When you spend a lot of time drawing up tactical manuals, when you spend a lot of time drilling in a particular way, changing over is very difficult. I think you get a natural inertia built into large bureaucratic organizations, which is what armies and navies were becoming. I think it was also a reflection of the class composition of the officer classes across Europe. They tended, by and large, to come from the country. They tended, by and large, to come from landed families, whether fairly modest landed families like some of the Anglo-Irish or some of the Junkers, or from some of the great aristocratic families. Increasingly, it is true, young men from the middle classes were becoming officers in the European armies, but what tended to happen is they took on the existing ethos. They tended to be absorbed into the existing ethos of the class or the group of which they were joining. And I think you saw across Europe, and it varied from country to country, but I think there was a pattern of young army officers, and then as they grew older, maintaining those values, who disliked much of modern warfare, even though it was their job to understand it, who hankered for what they saw as a purer and nobler kind of warfare. A tremendous enthusiasm in the late 19th century for the Middle Ages and for chivalry and for knightly war, a view that somehow there had been in the past a better, more pure, nobler sort of war. Tied up with this, I think, again, and this is a generalization, but I think it is fairly widespread among those who became officers, was a dislike for what they saw as urban values, a dislike for cosmopolitanism, a dislike often for Jews. And you saw it, I think, very clearly in the Dreyfus affair in France, where the first reaction, which was widely supported throughout the French army, was to blame the Jew, the only Jew in the French general staff, who everyone assumed must have been the one who was selling French military secrets to the Germans, in spite of what turned out to be flimsy or indeed confected evidence. And you've got people like Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke who was going to be assassinated at Sarajevo, who, like many of the European royalty, had been trained as a soldier. I mean, it was fairly commonplace for the sons, whether older or younger, of the ruling monarchs to be trained in the army or trained in the navy. Franz Ferdinand, who was himself very, very conservative, blamed the Jews in his many conversations with his colleagues for the end of the old hierarchical society, which had been based, he said, on sound Christian principles. I think what you also got among a lot of the officers, again it varied from country to country, was an uneasy sense that the way of life which had produced them, which they so valued, which had values that they thought were important, I mean, often we have to admit very decent values, values of duty, values of responsibility, values of bravery, was under threat and was perhaps disappearing. And so I think that sense that they represented a class that was doomed to disappear or was certainly under attack, that they represented a class which had values which were inimical to those of much of modern society, helped to increase their resistance to the ways in which war was changing. It's very striking to me how often, by the end of the 19th century, people were talking, again, particularly in these classes, about notions of honor and shame. And these things seemed to take on an added importance, perhaps as there was a sense that society was changing. The Austrian Army Handbook in 1889 said the strict interpretation of military honor ennobles the officer corps in its entirety and endows it with the character of knighthood. It seems to me there's a real nostalgia in there for a way of life which they feared was vanishing. And those ideas of honor and shame were often transposed to the nation. You get people talking about Russia's honor, about Germany's honor, about Britain's honor. When Sir Edward Grey goes to the House of Commons on the 4th of August to say that Britain is probably going to find itself in a state of war with Germany, he talks about the obligations of honor. And I think these are in some ways indicative of the way in which military values or the values of this particular class continued to inform discussion in Europe. It's also striking to me how dueling was on the increase rather than the decrease across Europe. Not in Britain, where it had been outlawed, and the British were often castigated by Europeans for this. The Kaiser said, "What do you expect of the British? They're a nation of shopkeepers, and they don't have the proper values." But we in Germany understand about dueling. In 1913, when there was talk in public in Germany, it was a public discussion of abolishing dueling in the army, the Prussian Minister of War, General von Falkenhayn, protested to the Chancellor, "The roots of the duel are embedded and grow in our code of honor. This code of honor is a valuable and, for the officer corps, an irreplaceable treasure." Those who were prepared to fight duels, who were prepared to risk their lives to defend their honor, were seen as the sorts of people you wanted to be army officers. You had very much the same thing in the Austrian army and in the French army. Even in the good Republican French army, an officer who refused to fight a duel on inadequate grounds could be cashiered. The French felt that it was essential to have people who were prepared to uphold the right sort of values. And so I think you get a mentality, a frame of mind, which is uncomfortable in the modern world, doesn't like all the manifestations of the modern world, even though the intelligent officers know that they're going to have to deal with it and they're going to have to deal with the new weapons. But there is a resistance. There's a resistance, for example, to machine guns, which are seen as noisy, rackety, and somehow rather unsporting. It is said that a British battalion commander at the start of World War I was given some machine guns and said, as he was given them to the officer who had come to explain how to use them, "Take the damn things to a flank and hide them." He simply didn't want to see them. There was also, in certain armies, the British Army perhaps exemplified this more than others, was certain resistance to improving military education. The Staff College, to train officers in the arts of war, to train them in how to read maps, to train them in how to deal with some of the modern weaponry, was initially not popular among British officers. One British officer from a very fashionable regiment who thought of applying to the Staff College was told by one of his fellow officers, "Well, I will give you one piece of advice, and that is to say nothing about it to your brother officers, or you will get yourself jolly well disliked." When officers did go to the Staff College, they tended, and perhaps this was a pose, but they pretended not to know where the library was. And there was a sort of pose of not doing much work. Smith Dorrien, who actually was, in the end, quite a good general, said, "I enjoyed," talking of the Staff College, "I enjoyed every minute of my 2 years there. I did not think we was taught as much as we might have been, but there was plenty of sport and not too much work." In the Austrian army, cavalry officers who tended to, I think, be particularly conservative in their reactions, again, I think because they were afraid that their horses were going to be removed from under them and they were going to be turned into something else which they resisted, were contemptuous of other branches of the army. Austrian army cavalry officers called those in the artillery the powder Jews. Even among artillery officers themselves, riding was considered to be more important than technical expertise. And so I think there was a bias in favor of certain values and not others. There was also, I think, an apprehension, and I mentioned this last night, among a lot of the officer class, that the sort of people they were conscripting into the European armies, and all major powers in Europe, with the exception of Britain, had gone over to conscription by the last quarter of the 19th century. There was also fear that they were doing something rather foolish and potentially damaging to themselves in training people from the lower classes who might one day learn how to fight against them and use those weapons against them. The German army, as I mentioned yesterday, was torn right up until the eve of the First World War between wanting to train more soldiers and fearing the consequences of doing that. There were other sorts of fears too, and these were not just among army officers. I think they were among European conservative elites as well. Fears that the race was somehow getting weakened, that the very progress that European society was enjoying was leading to degeneracy. And I mentioned this yesterday. There were books with titles like Degeneracy, which warned that modern man and modern women were enfeebled, no longer had the stamina and the courage and the determination of those who used to live in the country. In 1905, a young conservative published a pamphlet called The Decline and Fall of the British Empire. The topics included the prevalence of town over country life and its disastrous effect upon the faith and health of the British people. Another one was excessive taxation and municipal extravagance. It's sounding very contemporary, actually. The inability of the British to defend themselves and their empire. And in a lot of the writing in this pamphlet, but elsewhere, there were a lot of references to Rome and what had gone wrong with the Roman Empire and about how the Romans had become degenerate and weak and no longer capable of defending themselves. There was fear that young men were too interested in urban pleasures, too interested in the arts. Field Marshal Sir Garnet Wolseley, who was commander-in-chief in Britain from 1895 to 1900, said gloomily it was a very bad sign that ballet dancers and opera singers were now highly valued in British society. The author of the leading German handbook on tactics said that modern man was losing his physical and spiritual powers. He said, the steadily improving standards of living tend to increase the instinct of self-preservation and to diminish the spirit of self-sacrifice. There was also concern about what was happening to Europe's women. They seemed to be moving out of the household, moving away from their traditional roles. They seemed to be demanding a share in society, which a number of men found very concerning. And there was a real worry in certain countries over declining fertility. French women were not having as many babies as they'd had before, whereas German women continued to reproduce at a higher rate, and this was seen as a long-term demographic problem for the French. There was simply in the future going to be more potential German soldiers than potential French soldiers. The French worried about it. The Germans often noted it with interest, not to say appreciation. A leading German intellectual said to a French journalist shortly before the First World War, "A people whose men don't want to be soldiers and whose women refuse to have children is a people benumbed in their vitality. It is fated to be dominated by a younger and fresher race." And so these are the sorts of fears that helped to shape the intellectual framework within which people began to think about war. There was also a fear that modern human beings, because of the way in which they had changed, were not adapted or not suited for a defensive war. That an offensive war which got them together, got them excited, might work. But the necessity of slogging it out, a long drawn-out war, the strains imposed by a long drawn-out war, could not be borne by modern people. All of this contributed to what has been called by some the cult of the offensive. There were a number of reasons why continuing to talk about how to attack, continuing to try and overcome or minimize the growing power of the defense was very, very widespread in European military thinking and commentary before the First World War. The offensive was stressed partly, as I mentioned yesterday, because it seemed to represent the laws of war. military study had looked at the great battles of the past, and what history seemed to suggest was that going on the attack was the only way to win a war, that defensive wars did not win in the long run. And so the battles that were studied, as I mentioned yesterday, were things like the Battle of Cannae and the Punic Wars, Austerlitz, one of Napoleon's great victories, Battle of Waterloo, of course, and much more recently the Battle of Sedan, where the German army had encircled the French army in 1870 and forced it to surrender. The offensive was seen not just as something that was inherent in the nature of war, but in many quarters it was also seen as a way of papering over divisions in society, because Europe was, in many ways, a divided society. Understandably, rapid progress had produced strains. There were extreme divisions in a number of societies. There was fear among the upper classes about growing working class, the growing enthusiasm of that working class for socialism, fear also of revolution, fear of international terrorism. And the offensive war was seen as a way of bringing people together, of trying to overcome their differences. And war itself was seen, in particular, I think, in conservative and reactionary circles, as something that might give them the excuse to do what they'd been wanting to do anyway. German circles, some of the circles around the Kaiser in Germany, which tended to be conservative, if not reactionary, repeatedly called for dissolving the Reichstag and getting rid of the Constitution and cracking down. In 1912, when the Reichstag elections produced significant gains for the Social Democratic Party, they gained some 67 new seats and became the largest single party in the Reichstag. The leader of the Conservative and Nationalist Agrarian League published a pamphlet which was entitled "If I Were Kaiser," in which he argued that a good victorious war would give the government an excuse to get rid of universal suffrage. And so war was seen, in some circles at least, as a way out of dilemmas. I think there was also a disdain for the defensive sort of war as somehow not being as virile and as active as a proper offensive war. Now, having said this, I think we need to remember that not everyone in Europe felt like this, that there were those who were very, very skeptical of the idea that offensive wars were a good thing, those, of course, who were very skeptical of the idea that war itself was a good thing. We always have to remember that in the Europe of the decades before the First World War, there was a very large peace movement, very large middle-class peace movement, which was truly international in its links and in its scope, which argued strenuously for using such things as arbitration as a way of settling disputes among nations. And there was considerable public support for this. And indeed, there was a growing willingness of nations themselves to use arbitration as a way of settling disputes, border disputes, for example, or disputes for compensation. 300 arbitrations were held between the end of the Napoleonic Wars and 1914, and more than half of those took place after 1890. So you can see a real increase in the number of arbitrations. And you've got an international peace movement also talking about limiting arms, ways of building confidence among nations. And you had, of course, a huge working class movement in the Second International, which at its conferences, its international congresses, repeatedly talked about how its members would not support a capitalist war. And they tended to assume that almost any war would be such a war. They would, if they chose, or they could if they chose, go on strike, making it impossible for the factories to produce the equipment needed for war, making it impossible for the trains and the steamships to run, and of course, encouraging those who were being called back to the colors with mobilization to refuse to come. And it was something of a nightmare for those who were doing military planning that the peace movement would actually exert a considerable influence over the public, and it would be impossible to wage a war. Having said that, the military continued to plan for war. They at least took it for granted that war was an integral part of human society. And what they continued to do was study past examples of war, but they studied them, I think it's fair to say, on the whole quite selectively. They looked at examples of successful battles, and they tended to assume that those had actually settled a war. The Battle of Waterloo was a particularly interesting one. It seemed to show that a decisive victory would bring a war to an end. What I think they failed to take into account is that Waterloo came at the end of a very long series of wars, came at the end of a very long campaign, and that the reason that the French finally capitulated is because they basically had exhausted their resources and were not prepared to go on fighting, or enough French people were not prepared to go on fighting. So you could argue that it wasn't the Battle of Waterloo itself that brought the Napoleonic Wars to an end. It was the cumulative effect of all the fighting that had gone on before that. They also looked more recently at colonial wars, and these again gave rather bad guidance because most of the colonial wars had been won by the colonial powers, and so they tended to assume that what they were doing was right. They argued that colonial wars showed that in fact you needed to get out, you needed to march out in a column, you needed to pacify the countryside. If you sat in your trenches, you wouldn't be able to have an effect. Sir Garnet Wolseley again, who seems to have had many views on many things, said in fact that entrenchments are a bad thing because they depress the will to attack. Colonial wars, he argued, had shown this. In the 1890s, the British Inspector General of Cavalry said that in fact technological advances were making it easier to attack. And one of the technological advances had been smokeless gunpowder, which all European armies had adopted by this point. What smokeless gunpowder meant, among other things, is that battles were no longer fought in a thick fog. It also meant that if you were concealed, or if you were a sniper in a tree or a church tower, if you fired, there was no telltale puff of smoke to give away your position. And so again, you would think that naturally this was making the defensive easier. Well, the Inspector of Cavalry, Keith Fraser, did not think so. He said the smokeless gunpowder, in fact, is a good thing because it leaves the battlefield clear, which means that the cavalry charge will be much more terrifying. The defenders will be able to see them coming across the field, and they will be so demoralized by this sight that they'll, well, he didn't quite say it, I'm exaggerating now, they'll throw away their guns and give up. So that study of the past did not necessarily lead to what you might think were useful, or at least useful conclusions, or ones worth thinking about. The American Civil War, of course, as I mentioned yesterday, was studied a lot. But if you looked at what happened during the American Civil War, so often the defenders were able to inflict really appalling losses on those who were attacking. If you look at the Franco-Prussian War, yes, it is true that in the end the Germans won, but there were battles leading up to the last Battle of Sedan in which the Germans took terrible losses against very well-defended French lines, and vice versa. The French took dreadful losses against very well-defended German lines. In the 1877 Russo-Turkish War, the Turks dug themselves in at Plevna. They had better rifles than the Russians. They had much better defenses. The Russians outnumbered them 3-1, but in spite of repeated attacks, they were unable to take Plevna. The only reason they took it in the end was when the defenders' supplies ran out. It was not because they actually overwhelmed it. In the Boer War and the South African War, again, the British took dreadful losses. The Afrikaner farmers tended to wear what they worked in the fields in, which was sort of dust-colored clothes. And the British were still wearing their bright red uniforms and provided, of course, admirable targets for the Afrikaners, who were, by and large, very good shots. And the Afrikaners learnt to dig themselves in. They learned how to use field artillery. And in the initial stages of the war, the British took terrible losses. In the Black Week of December 1899, the British suffered a series of losses. Let me just talk about one at the Battle of Colenso. General Neville Littleton, who was there, had also been at Omdurman when British forces had slaughtered the troops of the Mahdi as these troops came rushing towards them. And what Littleton said in the first battle at Omdurman, 50,000 fanatics streamed across the open regardless of cover to certain death. While at Colenso, I never saw a Boer all day till the battle was over, and it was our men who were the victims. So there was evidence of what could happen when you had very well-defended positions. I won't go through it all. The same thing happened in the Russo-Japanese War, but the Japanese eventually won. And the Russians surrendered at Port Arthur, a lot of argument whether they needed to have done. And so the conclusion that many drew was that the Japanese had been right to attack. And indeed, there was considerable admiration in European military circles for the determination with which the Japanese had kept on attacking, for the extraordinary ability of the Japanese to take huge losses. Sir Ian Hamilton, who was out there as a British military observer, said it is not too late, he said, it's almost too late, but it's not too late to try and instill the same sort of spirit in little British boys. He said every school book, every book they read, every toy they play with must be directed towards instilling this sort of spirit of self-sacrifice in them, or we will be in for dreadful trouble. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, again, the defense inflicted terrible casualties on the offense, but again it seemed to show, or so people felt, that attacking nevertheless worked. And so what you got was really, I think, an unwillingness to accept what seems in retrospect to have been fairly compelling evidence. A lot of Europeans studied the Civil War, but a lot didn't want to study it. One European general said of the American Civil War, "Those savage encounters do not deserve the name of war, and I have dissuaded my officers from reading the published accounts of them." At the Royal United Services Institute in May 1899, there was an interesting discussion which I was reading about the other day. A Captain W.H. James from the Royal Engineers gave a talk which, to modern eyes, seems rather sensible. He talked about how changing conditions of war had so altered the battlefield that there was a need to ask whether the old methods of handling troops and ordering troops into battle still worked. He pointed out that men were exposed to fire for much longer, that when they attacked, you could no longer have, as you'd had in the past, supporting troops very close behind, because they would simply make another very good target. If you had your support troops coming immediately behind, then they would be shot as well. He argued for things like use of explosives to get at defenders. He argued for more imaginative tactics on the battlefield. He argued for what in fact was going to be used during the First World War towards the end, and that was for small groups of men rushing forward, taking cover wherever they could, rather than the very disciplined lines coming over the top. He also argued that they should cut back on the loads they carried so they'd be quicker and more mobile on the battlefields. And what was interesting was what the audience said. Very politely, and this is, of course, what always happens at lectures, people said, "Thank you, very interesting lecture, but I do want to point out you're completely wrong." A Lieutenant Colonel Gunter said, "You're overdoing the advantage of the defense." He said, "You have to think of the counterattack." Nothing, he said, could exaggerate the great moral effect of the attack. And then an infantry major, whose name unfortunately I haven't recorded, got up and said, "Superiority of fire really depends in the end on the superiority of the men behind the weapons. And so if you have the best men attacking, it doesn't matter what sort of weapons the men in the trenches have. Anyway," he said, "defenders get rattled and lots of the bullets they fire go into the ground rather than into the target." And the general feeling, at least as much as one can gather from reading the records of the meeting, seems to have been that Lieutenant James really was being rather alarmist, and that he wasn't truly understanding what war could be like. Warnings about what was happening to war also came from civilians. They came from people like Bertha von Suttner, who was one of the founders of the middle-class the peace movement in Europe, and from the great French socialist politician Jean Jaurès. But perhaps the most detailed and most thorough and most prescient warning came from Ivan Bloch, a Polish Jew who had converted to Christianity as a young man, who had become a great tycoon in Russia, had helped to build a number of the Russian railways, had become a great financier, and had become convinced that modern warfare was going to turn into a dreadful stalemate, and devoted the last part of his life to trying to warn people about what he saw was coming. He wrote a massive 6-volume book on the future of war. Not all of it was right, but a lot of it was very close to what the First World War actually was like. He predicted the stalemate. He predicted that neither side would be strong enough to overcome the other. He predicted that the war would turn into something long, that it would begin to draw in more and more of the resources of society. And he talked in great detail about why this was so. He spoke at the United Service Institute in London, which was, I think, brave of him, in 1901, and the audience was not as polite as they had been with their fellow officer a couple of years earlier. The audience was, in fact, very angry. One major general got up and saying, "This is so-called non-jingoism or non-militarism, namby-pamby so-called humanitarianism." Ian Hamilton, when he read The Man Who Was Out in the Far East, Ian Hamilton simply called Bloch's work trash. and it was attacked widely. Some people worried about it, and the Russian military bloc was, after all, Russian. The Russian military, the Russian general staff took him seriously enough to write and publish detailed attacks on it. The trouble from the military point of view is they were caught in a dilemma. They didn't like the way war was going. They didn't like the idea they could no longer do what they had done. They didn't like the idea that the attack was no longer going to work. And the trouble was, of course, that they were caught in a technological dilemma as well, that the weapons and the things such as barbed wire and the spades making for stronger defenses were not yet, solutions for dealing with the strong defense had not yet been found. Those solutions were going to be found, partly in the course of the First World War. Armored vehicles, the tank, for example, which could carry soldiers and their firepower through the defenses, if they were fortunate and if they were strong enough, and aircraft, which as they got stronger and faster could fly above the trenches and expose the defenders to fire from above or to projectiles being dropped from above. But those methods hadn't yet come. And I think the military felt very acutely that they were caught in this dilemma. But their reaction, I think, in too many cases, and I think this is particularly true of those in charge, was to wish, I think, that war would still be a matter of glorious attack and still be something short. I see them very much as gamblers, prepared to take a chance in the hopes that they might win, prepared to throw more and more resources into the battlefield because they couldn't really think of any alternatives. And so you got, in the military training and in the military preparations for war before 1914, a lot of stress on morale, on how to inculcate the right sort of spirit into the troops. What you needed was more and better and more motivated troops. And this partly reflects the changing nature of war, their attempt to try, almost in a way, try and ignore it and to maintain the offensive. I think partly reflects the fact that they didn't really trust the quality of many of the recruits they were getting. And they felt that they needed to be given spiritual and psychological training as well as military training. One of the great French theorists was a man with a wonderful name of Ardant Dupic, who argued that in battle, really it's the moral force that is going to win. He described battle as two moral activities where, rather than two, he said, where two moral activities rather than two material activities confront one another, and the stronger will carry the day. And so there's a lot of emphasis on this issue of how to get into the soldier's character, the will, the determination, the ability to sacrifice. And so bayonet drill, for example, was seen as very useful because it encouraged the soldiers to attack. Such ideas, of course, were very much affected by intellectual currents in Europe at the time. I don't want to suggest that the military were somehow in a strange bubble of their own. They were, in fact, very much part of European society, at least in the ways in which they thought about human beings and how to motivate them. They were influenced by people like Henri Bergson, who talked so much about the human spirit, about the necessity to appreciate that the human spirit is not just materialistic substance, but there is something called the élan vital. They were influenced, of course, by social Darwinism, and this was something that influenced thought across Europe, but I think it had a particular resonance in the military, because what social Darwinism appeared to argue was that human nature, human society, is composed, at least in part, of eternal struggle, that human beings struggle to survive and human societies struggle to survive, and that war is therefore an integral part of human society. Very English magazine, The 19th Century, which on the whole was, I think, a fairly liberal publication, said before World War I, the only court in which nations' issues can and will be tried is the court of God, which is war. I mean, a belief, not everyone again believed it, but I think it was something that was widespread across European society, and again had a particular resonance among the military because it so seemed to fit with what they did and what they argued. Konrad von Hotzendorf, the Austrian chief of staff, in his copious writings, talks again and again about the need to struggle, how those who don't struggle are condemned to disappear. A people, he said on one occasion, that lays down its weapons, seals its fate. Again, the Royal United Services Institute Journal, which has become my favorite reading lately, said in it, I don't recommend it to everyone, said in 1898, is not war the grand scheme of nature by which degenerate, weak, or otherwise harmful states are eliminated from the concerted action of civilized nations and assimilated to those who are strong, vital, and beneficial in their influences? Undoubtedly, this is so. And so you got, in the military, a belief that war was inevitable and indeed a good thing for any number of reasons. And this was reflected in their training, reflected even in some countries in the uniforms. As you probably know, there was a strong debate in the French Parliament shortly before the First World War about whether or not French soldiers should be put into camouflage uniforms. Increasingly, this was happening to make them less visible on the battlefield. And there were two objections to this. One was prudential. We've spent a lot of money on these uniforms. It would be a waste of money to get rid of them. And then there was also, well, there were three actually. There was the prudential one, we don't want to waste this money. There was a stylistic one, these are awful and make them look like bus conductors. And then there was the spiritual or psychological one, as the war minister cried. And one of the proposals was to get rid of the red trousers that French soldiers wore. And as the war minister said at the time, le pantalon rouge, c'est la France. And so the French soldiers went into war in 1914 wearing red trousers. And you can imagine what happened. Military education, again, stressed the offensive and stressed the attack. In a famous series of lectures at the French Staff College, the head of the Planning Bureau in the French General Staff, Colonel Louis de Grandmaison, said, "We must have sudden attacks, they paralyze the enemy. With a sudden attack, the enemy can no longer maneuver and very quickly becomes incapable of all offensive action." Ferdinand Foch, who was then an instructor at the War College, later, of course, to be the Supreme Allied Commander-in-Chief, presented proof that any improvement of firearms is ultimately bound to add strength to the offensive, and came up with elaborate calculations which showed that if two battalions of attackers can fire twice as many bullets as one of defenders, and so inevitably they would win. There'd simply be twice as many bullets flying at the defenders, ergo the defenders would lose. And so in all the European infantry regulations, pretty much the stress was on the attack, on maneuver, on getting the soldiers to move out, and still tremendous stress on cavalry. It must be accepted as a principle, said the 1907 British Cavalry Manual, that the rifle, effective as it is, cannot replace the effect produced by the speed of the horse, the magnetism of the charge, and the terror of cold steel. And so the cavalry went into the war expecting to charge. In 1913, the French army published a new doctrine which said the French army, returning to its traditions, no longer knows any other law than the offensive. All attacks are to be pushed to the extreme, to charge the enemy with bayonet in order to destroy him. This, it went on, this result can only be obtained at the price of bloody sacrifice, but any other conception ought to be rejected as contrary to the very nature of war. And so you get European armies going into the war of 1914 with the hope, sometimes a hope, I think, which they grasped at, that they would be able to attack. And you got, sadly, and I'll just come to this at the end, a willingness of large sections of society to accept that the military knew best. As the 19th century wore on, I think in many countries the military took on a particular aura, and I think it was tied up with nationalism as the noblest and best part of society, as the defenders of the nation. And this, of course, suited the military in many countries, who tended to see themselves as above criticism, above questioning, and above reproach. A very famous incident in Germany in 1913 in Alsace, which had been taken from France at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, in a town which today is called Saverne, but then was called Zabern, where locals apparently objected when a young German officer called them by a rude name. And the officer, instead of apologizing, was furious that he should be criticized, furious that local papers were making fun of him, and the local military establishment backed him up. Newspapers were closed down, their writers were thrown in jail, civilians were pushed around. And although there was, to the credit of the German public, an outcry, and there was a considerable fuss in the Reichstag, the military establishment in Germany, with the backing of the government, closed ranks and refused to discipline any of the officers involved, although did in fact move some of them quietly out. And so I think there was a sense that the military felt that they were above reproach, they were above criticism. And it was truer in some countries than others. I think certainly truer in Germany perhaps than it might have been in France. But what you also got, and this was the other side of militarism, was the permeation of civilian society by military values. And I think you see it in the fact that so many of Europe's leaders wore military uniforms rather than civilian clothes. Not in France, as a good republic, and not in Britain. But if you looked in Germany, the Chancellor, Bethmann Hollweg, wore his colonel's uniform to the Reichstag, which I think would be unthinkable today in a politician to wear his military uniform. And if you look at the pictures of the crowned heads of Europe, it's very, very rare to see any of them in civilian clothes. You almost always see them in uniform. And the military encouraged, and society, in some cases, societies encouraged the formation of paramilitary organizations. In a lot of European societies, you had organizations of cadets, of young boys, to try and instill in them the right sort of military values. You also got increasing popularity of military displays, of massive displays, marching bands, massive displays. In 1909, the British Navy had a week in London showing off its battleships, inviting families and to come aboard. It was careful in its timing, and the timing was chosen carefully because it was during the crisis over increased naval spending, and the Navy was trying to encourage the right sort of thought. And you also got, in the popular literature, a promotion in many countries of military values. G.A. Henty, the writer who wrote some appalling number of novels, I think about 113, all of which have exactly the same plot as far, I haven't read them all, but I remember reading some of them. And the plot is basically poor but honest boy falls afoul of rich but dishonest boy. But luckily, sensible commander, whether it's Clive in India or Kitchener at Khartoum, recognizes in time that the poor but honest boy is the person who should be promoted. I mean, the plots tend to be rather similar, so if you read one, you have read them all. And I think you did get a sense that the military were to be emulated, that their values were to be emulated, which I think further enhanced the belief among many of the military themselves that they should not be questioned. And one of the things, of course, that happened, and I'll talk about tomorrow, is that in certain countries, again, Germany comes to mind, but it was true also in Britain and true at times in France and Russia, the civilians either were not told or failed to acquaint themselves with what it was that the military were up to and what it was that the military were planning. And the military saw no reason to tell the civilians what they were doing because they felt it was not the civilians' business. The final point I want to come to just before I finish, and that is that for many people, the long period of peace in Europe brought, funnily enough, not so much an attraction towards a continuation of that peace, but a hankering for the glamour of war itself. And this is something that I think we can never underestimate. Not just people warnings, as a military warning about the dangers of peace, but a sense that modern society was somehow lacking something, that there were excitements which people were not sharing in. You got complaints by young German men that they were fed up with hearing from their fathers and their uncles about how they had fought in the German wars of unification, and what has the younger generation done? And you got the younger generation thinking, well, we'd like to do something ourselves. We'd like to actually show that we can do something for our countries. War correspondence and stories of wars became increasingly popular, and newspapers, always quick to understand this, recognized that covering wars was very good for sales. The Daily News, for example, trebled, the Daily News, an English newspaper, trebled its circulation when it covered the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. You also got huge and enthusiastic crowds turning out for commemorations of past glories. Trafalgar was commemorated in 1905. In Russia, Borodino, commemorated in 1912. In Germany, Leipzig, the Battle of Leipzig, which was a very important battle for the Prussians and which gave them back the confidence they had lost during the Napoleonic Wars. The Battle of Leipzig was commemorated with, among other things, 275,000 gymnasts in a gigantic display, and a massive monument with huge stone knights in armor was built as part of the commemoration. And you got at least some among the younger generation saying how boring peace was. Stefan George, the poet, talked about the cowardly years of trash and triviality. And Marinetti, the futurist, and in fact future fascist, said famously, "War is the sole hygiene of the world." Even liberals, I think, understood it. G.P. Gooch, a leading British liberal, said, "Long immunities from the realities of warfare has blunted our imaginations. We love excitement not a whit less than the Latin race. Our lives are dull. A victory is a thing the meanest of us can understand." And so I think, in a paradoxical way, you had a sense in Europe that peace was boring and that war actually was glamorous. And so, throughout Europe before 1914, you got people thinking about war, you got the military preparing for war, and I would argue you got Europe, in many parts of Europe, people increasingly psychologically ready for war. Thank you.